Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. Have you heard of the bookstore El Ateneo Grand Splendid? This is a famous bookstore that is located in Buenos Aires, and it was once voted #2 of the most beautiful bookstores in the world. The cool thing about it is that it is located in a place that used to be a theater, so that's why it looks so breathtaking and so unique. I'm showing you some pictures here, but I wanted to invite you to look for some pictures yourself on the internet because the ones that I'm showing you I took myself, and it was with a very cheap camera, so I feel that they do not really do justice to this great bookstore. But Jorge, why are you telling me about this fantastic bookstore? Well, here's the thing. I visited El Ateneo Grand Splendid for the first time when I was 19 years old and already living in the US. So you could say I visited this place as a tourist in my own country. And back then, I was not as much of a reader as I am today, so I had to tell myself, actually, Jorge, you need to get one book from this bookstore. And the one that I chose was Jean-Paul Sartre's famous novel, La Nausée, or Nausea, or as the title in Spanish goes, La Nausea. I always associate Sartre with my first semesters of my college experience. Back then, the first literary text, or one of the first at least, that I read without being required reading was the collection The Wall and Other Stories. This is a classic collection of tales by Sartre. One of them, the last one, I think could be regarded as a novella, The Childhood of a Leader, this classic story that was made into a movie recently. And other tales that it contains are The Wall, of course, The Room, Intimacy, and one of Sartre's most famous short stories, which is Erostratus. So I highly recommend this collection of stories. I continued my reading of Sartre with No Exit and Other Place. The other plays are The Flies, Dirty Hands, and The Respectful Prostitute. But the one that I enjoyed the most was, of course, No Exit. By the way, a little bit of trivia. If you watch Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives, you can see a little kid reading No Exit there at the beginning of the movie. So I really enjoyed the plays also, and it just seems that the next logical step for me would be to read Nausea, because that was his most famous text after the ones that I had read. So let me tell you a little bit about this novel, okay, before we start looking at the text in more detail. It was published in 1938, and it belongs to that great tradition of what I call the outsider novels. The father of all of them is probably Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky, though this is a novella, not really a novel, but don't get me started on that. Other texts that you can find that fall under this category are, of course, The Stranger by Albert Camus. Then you have something like Hunger by Knut Hamsun, Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse, and many texts, believe it or not, from Latin America. One of them I have already told you about in detail, and that is The Tunnel, or El Túnel, by Ernesto Sabato. And there's another text that is very, very closely related to El Túnel. It is by Juan Carlos Onetti, and it's titled El Pozo, or The Pit. This was one of the first texts that he wrote, actually. It's very brief. We're talking about some 40 pages or something like that. And it's really important. So, it's a text that I wish more readers would experience. There has always been a fascination, right, with these figures, these loners, these outsiders, especially in the 20th century. These antisocial characters who do not fit in and who show you really the ugly aspects of the society that we live in. And Nausea, Sartre dedicated to his partner, who was Simone de Beauvoir. I thought that was really, really interesting. I was thinking back in the day when you wanted to dedicate something to your significant other, you wrote a sonnet or a poem or something romantic or something like that. But you know how it is. Fast forward to the 20th century between the two wars, and it's more like, darling, I wrote a novel for you. Oh, how sweet. What's the title? Nausea. That is so typical of that time, and I think it speaks volumes by itself. Let me tell you a little bit now about the structure and the premise. And by structure here, I mean more like the subgenre, really. Because Nausea is the diary of a guy by the name of Antoine Roquentin. That means that the structure here is really flexible. As you know, a diary, anything can go into a diary. It can be full of important things, banal things, literally everything. But one thing to keep in mind about diaries is that most of the time, I would say 99% of the time, they are meant only for the eyes of the person who is writing the diary. A diary is not something that most of the time is publicized, right? So that's something that goes very closely together with the genre that we have to consider as we read this novel. And related to that, before the actual diary begins or the novel begins, we have two things that are very important. The first one is a note from the editors, okay? And then after that, we have a couple of undated loose pages to the diary. And these have very important purposes here. For example, from the note from the editors, you learn that something happened to Antoine, and we don't really know what that is, right? Who are these editors who found this diary? Where did they find it? Why are they publishing it? So it really raises a lot of questions. And then from the loose pages, what you learn is that really what we have here is the unreliable narrator par excellence. I think you can always almost say that a first-person narrator is unreliable, but in this case, it's even worse than that, because Antoine is even considering in those two undated pages whether he is insane or not. He comes to the conclusion that he is not, but can you really believe him? Antoine is an ordinary man who is living in a place called Bouville. That translates literally as mud town or mud city. And what he's doing is that he is working on a book on the life of a fictional character by the name of Rolbon. So by that and by what I have told you so far, you can tell that there are two texts here happening at the same time, simultaneously. We have, of course, on the one hand, the diary of Roquentin, so the novel itself, Nausea, and at the same time, simultaneously, you have the book that Antoine is working on, this life of Rolbon. So as we read the text, these two texts are happening at the same time, and I think that is really, really neat in terms of a structure and in terms of an expansion of what we are seeing in the novel. And as Antoine points out at one point here, his whole reason for living is this Rolbon character. He needs this other character. He also says that Rolbon needs him because he is writing his story. But the point here is that Antoine almost feels, you could say, insufficient in and of himself. He needs this other person in order to give some kind of meaning to his life. So what's up with this guy Antoine? Okay, Antoine begins by writing that at one point in his life something changed. Okay, something happened to him. And he comes to the conclusion that the change was something in the way that he perceives the world around him. At one point, for example, he says that he was trying to pick up a piece of paper from the floor, and he was unable to do that. He felt as if it were that he had some kind of a nausea in his hands. Then one day he looks at himself in the mirror, and he says that what he sees in the mirror he cannot recognize or identify as human. So you have a lot of self-loathing, a lot of self-disgust going on right here. And you may think, isn't that a little bit extreme? Isn't that too much, maybe, in a way? Well, I was thinking, about a year ago, I had a personal experience that really made me understand this text a lot more. I think I mentioned this in a previous video, but back in February of last year now, I had to have surgery. I'm not going to go into the details because I don't even want to think about this thing, but let's just say that it involved an incision and a few days of recovery period. And during those days, especially the third day, they say that the third day is the worst after surgery, and that was really the experience for me. I felt so awful. I was under the effects of the anesthesia and taking painkillers. I was in a lot of pain and I couldn't function the way I wanted to. I couldn't do the things that I usually did. Everything seemed a lot more difficult. I seemed to be heavier. I had this idea that my body was heavier, and I was just disgusted, with myself, with my body. And I remember I thought, maybe this gives me an intimation of what Sartre was describing in his novel Nausea. So I could at least, after this experience, I could connect with this text a little bit more because I knew at least a little bit of what Antoine feels. Now whenever he writes Nausea, this is something important to consider. He uses a capital N. And he says that this is a type of disgust with life. But it is not only that. Let me give you exactly what he says about this so that we can have the words from the narrator himself. So Antoine says, "The nausea is not inside me. I feel it out there in the wall, in the suspenders, everywhere around me. It makes itself one with the cafe. I am the one who is within it." So that's Antoine. What about other people? Well, you know what Sartre says about other people, right? Seriously, other people are important too, because there are two people here that Antoine mentions. One of them is Annie. That's the woman that he thinks about the most. But keep in mind that he is also having regular, mechanical, loveless sex with a woman who is the owner of a cafe. But he thinks about Annie. This was a woman from his past. And then the other important character that we have is a guy that he calls the autodidact. This is a man that he meets primarily at the library. They talk about books, they talk about life, they talk about politics. And what this guy is doing, the autodidact, is he's going through books in alphabetical order. So I saw a sense of futility there. It's like, just this amassing of information, amassing of concepts. What for? What is the purpose of this, right? That's what this guy is doing. Just spends his life at the library right there, just reading books. So I see two parts to this novel, okay? You can basically take this novel and cut it in half at the midpoint, and you can divide it into two parts. And I wanted to share with you some ideas on these two parts very briefly so that we can keep this in mind if we want to explore this novel. So the first part is marked by banality and by despair. At first, it's going to seem to you that Antoine is just merely recording the things that he sees, almost as if his diary were a log, just describing the events that he experiences, the people that he sees, random conversations that he hears at the cafe or at the library. At one point, he's reading Eugénie Grandet by Balzac, and he says he's reading this book because one has to do something. So the banality of it all, the aimlessness. One day he has a moment of happiness, for example, and you're like, wow, at least we have some, just a little bit of a ray of sunshine right here. And this happiness comes to him almost like the nausea too. It's something that comes out of the blue. These are passions, right? And the following day, after writing this wonderful passage, he asks himself, how could I write a sentence so absurd and so pompous? So even when you have something that is kind of a ray of hope or something, right after that he questions it and he demolishes it with his questions. His only reason for living, once again, is roll-bon. Okay, so it seems that all that he knows, he has learned from books. He does not have a lot of life experience. He says, everything that I know comes from books. And when I read that, I thought of that famous phrase by Verlaine, the poet, the flesh is sad and I have read every book. So I thought of that, that is exactly the kind of thing that we have going on here. Now, in this first part of the novel that I have divided into two, there are a couple of things that I like to consider because they are important throughout the book. For example, Antoine is very conscious of his hands. There are passages throughout the book where he's looking at his hands or other people's hands. At one point when he's at the public garden, and a very important passage from the novel, he sees the branches of trees as if they were hands that are reaching out for the sky. So in himself, he's very conscious of his hands, but in other people, he is conscious of their gaze and their stare, the eyes, right? So look out for that throughout the novel. So that was part one, and then part two it is marked by revelation and a sense of crisis also. In this second part, Antoine has two encounters that are obligatory. One of them is, of course, with Annie, and the other one is with the autodidact. And the way I look at this is Annie represents the heart. I know that sounds a little bit too romantic for this text, but you know what I mean, the passions, the emotions. So Annie is the heart, and the autodidact is the brain or the mind. So that's why he has these two encounters in the second part. Both are utterly disappointing to him. He cannot have a relationship with Annie because she wants everything to be perfect. I take that to mean that she wants things to be like in a movie, right? And she's not going to have that with Antoine. And then on the other hand, the autodidact, Antoine is just disgusted with him because this guy is just a hypocrite. So even those two encounters, those two experiences that he has with other people, they do not work. So maybe we could go back to that phrase from No Exit, hell is other people, because you can definitely see this in Antoine. And the key scene also happens in this second part, and that is the scene at the public square, where Antoine is just overwhelmed with this idea or this sense of the absurd, that happens to him all of a sudden, and he comes to understand what the nausea actually means. He has an illumination or an anti-illumination, depending on how you want to look at it. And the key concept in this part, right, where he has this epiphany or anti-epiphany, is a concept that is very difficult to translate, literally at least, into English. And that is the idea of être, trop. I was so happy that I was reading this novel in Spanish, because we have the same phrase, the same concept in Spanish, literally. We say estar de más. That means like being extra, being too much. This has been translated into English as being in the way or as being superfluous. And that gives you almost an idea, a very close idea of what it means, this idea of être de trop. If you think about it this way, if you're at a party with strangers, and it's just not happening. You're not connecting with anybody. You cannot connect with people, and you feel all of a sudden as if you were extra right there, but in a negative sense, of course. It's like you're an odd person out, to put it in a different way. That is exactly what is meant by this être de trop. And Antoine feels that everything is an extra, that everything is superfluous, himself included, of course. And this is something that you cannot escape. It is unescapable. Even death is not an escape from this feeling of être de trop. Let me read to you the part where he shares these ideas with us. There are some things that I am skipping here in the middle. I'm just letting you know. Superfluous. It was the only relationship I could establish between these trees, these gates, these stones. And I, soft, weak, obscene, digesting, juggling with dismal thoughts, I too was superfluous. Even my death would have been superfluous. Superfluous my corpse, my blood on these stones, between these plants, at the back of this smiling garden. And the gnawed flesh would have been superfluous in the earth which would receive my bones. At last, cleaned, stripped, peeled, as clean as teeth, it would have been superfluous. I was superfluous for eternity. So what do we make of Antoine after this, right? Our friend is clearly not doing well, okay? But at the same time, he seems to be the logical result of that statement by Descartes, cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. You could even say, in this case, taking it a little bit further, I think too much, therefore I am going insane. That's kind of what's going on with him. And he even echoes the words of Descartes. Let me read you another passage right here. Antoine says, my thought is me. That's why I can't stop. I exist because I think, and I can't stop myself from thinking. At this very moment, it's frightful. If I exist, it is because I am horrified at existing. I am the one who pulls myself from the nothingness to which I aspire. So I would say Antoine really needs to get out of his head a little bit, okay? There's that idea that at the Temple of Apollo, there were two signs, and one of them said, know yourself, and the other one said, not too much, because there's a great danger in overthinking things, especially in overthinking oneself. I was also thinking of a phrase that is wrongly attributed to Kierkegaard, the one that says, life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. That is maybe something that Antoine needs to hear and to ponder on. Now, very interestingly, Sartre said that Nausea was a bit of an autobiographical text. In his book, The Words, Les Mots, which is an autobiographical, not really a novel, but just, I would say, directly autobiography, he shares this with us. He says, I was Roquentin. In him I exposed without self-satisfaction the web of my life. So maybe you could say at one point in his life at least, this was Jean-Paul Sartre. The novel basically shows us a life with no meaning because it does not have a purpose. Yet, we could add to that, right? This brings us to the main tenet of existentialism, which is, of course, the idea that existence precedes essence. That means, in a nutshell, that life itself, according to this worldview, is not meaningful, does not have meaning in itself, but each person has the responsibility of giving a meaning and a purpose to his or her life. Now, big question here, how do you do this, right? As far as Sartre was concerned, you had two options, la création ou l'action, creation or action, art, in other words, or some kind of involvement, some kind of commitment maybe to a cause. And you can see that Sartre actually did both of these. Okay, so you could say that he practiced what he preached, right? So that's a good thing for him. In a sense, I would say that Nausea only presents half of the story. The character here, Antoine, really needs to make a choice, and he has not done that in the novel itself. Maybe there's a bit of a difference there and a bit of a realization towards the end when you see him find a little bit of solace in that favorite music that he hears at the cafe. He says, "This is one of my favorites, can you play it again?" And after that, he starts thinking that maybe there's a way out of this pit, right? But why did he stop writing the diary? That is a question that readers may have. Before we explore that, let me talk a little bit about writing itself, since that is the key idea here. We have a diary in our hands, so writing is really one of the central themes of this novel. What is the role of writing in Nausea? So at the beginning of the novel, it would seem that Antoine is looking for a sense of adventure. He says that when you just have an experience in life, when you just live something, it doesn't really mean anything in itself. But the moment that you write it down, he says, there's a sense of adventure to what you're telling. It's just as, when you tell a story to somebody, maybe it's something that happened to you. It happened, okay, it existed, it was there. But when you tell it, the telling itself gives this idea of adventure, gives meaning to it. By telling a story, you're saying, look, what I'm about to say has meaning, because otherwise I wouldn't even bother telling you about this. So that's the first part of the novel. And I was wondering, is he trying to give meaning to all the things that are happening to him? These banal things, these trivial things. Maybe that's what he's doing, right? At the same time, he says that we must not trust quote-unquote literature. You have to be careful with literature. You just write things down. That's the way it should be. Simply write things down, record them. Otherwise, you're doing literature. And he wants to avoid that. But then towards the end of the novel, he thinks that maybe if he writes a good book, then he might be able to look back on his life and not feel that disgust that he feels. This is right after he listens to that song at the cafe. So the song inspires him. He says, maybe if I could write a book that is as good as this song, it will mean something to somebody else, right? So it's a very important moment for him. And the question that we ask ourselves at this point is, did he find the purpose, right? We know that he rejected suicide because he told us that before in that passage at the public square. So what happened, right? And this is open to interpretation. Now I want to share with you something that a critic wrote about this, and that has to do also, it is connected to the idea of why is this novel presented to us in the form of a diary. There's an article titled "The Writer and Society, an Interpretation of Nausea" by Marie McGuinn. Okay, I'm going to give you the full information, the access information in the description to this video so that you can access it if you're interested. And the critic here says, by writing the novel in the form of a diary, Sartre is able to catch Roquentin before he has succeeded in transmuting his experience into art, when his capacity to produce a work of art is still in question. The diary itself is something less than a work of art, for it merely records Roquentin's own experiences in his own words. The focus of our interest is not therefore on Roquentin's art, nor even on him as an artist, but on the moment of his psychological history, when he is led to choose himself as a writer, and when he serves as an exemplar of a particular stage of bourgeois evolution. So maybe what we are seeing here is really the moment when he said, I am going to write this book. And maybe that's one of the reasons why he stopped writing the diary. So, bottom line, Sartre's Nausea is really an excellent novel, but when I read it for the first time, I will say I did not like it at all. It seemed boring to me, it seemed tedious and just way too dark. But of course, that was exactly the point. That was something that I did not realize back then when I was 19 and I was not very experienced and I had not really read that much. This time around, I reread it, and I'm not going to tell you that I enjoyed it because I don't think that's a word, that's a verb that I can use when it comes to describing this novel. But I will say that I was able to appreciate it a lot more. This is a depressing novel, there's no question about that, but maybe there's a little bit of a ray of hope towards the end when he has that realization after he listens to that song. Maybe one of the reasons why Roquentin stopped writing the diary was because he finally started thinking about other people and not so much about himself, which is always something positive, I think, and always a way of getting ourselves out of those pits, out of those tunnels, out of those underground places, and back into the light. So I strongly recommend that you read Nausea, but I'm gonna say you may want to have an antidote close at hand. My personal antidote, right after reading this, I read The Little Prince. Okay, so you see what I'm saying. I was thinking maybe also the poems of Walt Whitman, these things that really exalt the positive aspects of life and of being alive. The works of G.K. Chesterton, these works that are just marked by a sense of gratitude, a sense of hilarity, and all of those positive things. So that's one thing, unless of course you're used to these kinds of texts and it doesn't do anything for you. In my case, I detach myself pretty well from what I read. So I can read something like Nausea and not be affected by it, but I still was like, let's read The Little Prince again. Let's reconnect with the sunshine. And there are many sad parts to The Little Prince, but that's another story. That would be an interesting question actually for you. What would you consider a good antidote to nausea? Right? What's a good novel maybe that we can read after reading something like this? No Longer Human, right? No. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Those are my 2 cents on Nausea by Jean-Paul Sartre. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.